and I hope you enjoyed the summer solstice yesterday. It fell Wednesday, June 21st at 12:24 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Of course, that means it was Tuesday, June 20th at 11:24 p.m. here. But that means this is our first show of the summer. Last week when we started the show, hi everybody, I'm Jeff Williams, your host of North Star Oasis. When we started the show last week, we mentioned it was June 16th and it was a spring day. Now, here we are in summer. And last week we had talked about the carbon cycle. We talked about the carbon deficit. And right now we're facing a carbon deficit, and the global climate, IPCC, Al Gore, Betty McCollum, all want to have a eradication of carbon dioxide by the year 2100. And we discussed a lot of that last week. But now, this week, we're still going to keep on that same theme on climate change. But we're going to take a look at it from a solution. You know, there's actually a little bit of a solution. And trees are the answer. Yes, you heard me say trees are the answer. Trees are the answer, but they're also the problem. And we're going to get into that in this particular show. But the thing is, as we've discussed last week, and our episodes are on YouTube and Facebook, youtube.com/NorthStarOasis, facebook.com/NorthStarOasis. So please give us a like on Facebook, watch our back episodes. But getting back to the point is that there's this move to eradicate carbon dioxide from our environment. We want to have zero carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2100. That's what the environmentalist left wants. They want no carbon dioxide anywhere, but yet carbon dioxide, as we discussed, is the thing that sustains life. So we covered a little bit of that last week. We looked into the chemistry of the carbon cycle. But now we're going to take a look at how carbon dioxide is used to sustain life. We're going to look at that a little closer today. So we're going to start off with our Prager University segment. Trees are the answer.
For all future stewards of the earth, and that's all of us, here's a quick quiz. What is the most renewable and sustainable material with which to build our homes? How can we turn some of the CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere into an asset? And how can we make the world more beautiful and green? The answer to all these questions is trees. Trees make up about 90% of all the living biomass on Earth, and forests serve as home to the majority of species on the planet. We use thousands of products, many every day, that come from trees. Some are obvious, like wood and paper, and many not so obvious, like microcrystalline cellulose, a key ingredient in many medicines. Anyway, who doesn't love trees? Yet trees, especially in the last few decades, have become very controversial. People are divided into two broad camps. One group sees trees as a critical source of renewable material and of renewable energy. This group generally favors planting trees and making use of the many products derived from them. The other group emphasizes the value of forests as ecosystems to provide a protected habitat for threatened species. This group prefers to see forests off limits to commercial use. The arguments between these two groups can get pretty heated. But here's the good news. If we do it right, we can use our trees and enjoy them too. Before I explain how, I need to define two terms. The first is forestry, which means the creation, management, and use of forests. The second term is deforestation, which means the permanent loss of forests. There are two widespread misconceptions about forestry. The first misconception is that forestry, as practiced by the forest industry, is responsible for deforestation. We may think that when we buy wood from a lumber yard, we are causing a bit of forest to be lost somewhere. But what we're really doing is sending a signal to the marketplace to plant more trees, to produce more wood, to supply the demand in the lumber yard. It is no different from any other renewable crop. It's just that trees take longer to mature than annual farm crops. The giant paper company Boise Cascade is just as much in the business of planting trees as it is in harvesting them. The key point is it's not the harvesting of trees that causes deforestation. Deforestation is the result of harvesting and then not replanting a forest or not letting it grow back naturally, which it would do if just left alone. Deforestation sounds like a bad word, and it can be, but usually it's not. All it means is that after the trees are harvested, the land is used for a different purpose. The largest cause of deforestation is agriculture, the creation of new farmland. But farming is important. After all, the world has 7 billion people to feed. Another reason for deforestation is to make way for towns and cities. Manhattan was once a great forest. Now it's a great city. The second misconception about forestry is the tendency to judge landscapes by how they look to our eyes. We easily make the mistake of using our sense of what is beautiful and what is unsightly to judge the ecology of the land. This results in repulsion at the sight of a recently logged landscape because it looks ravaged, destroyed, and unsightly. We don't react this way to a landscape of pasture with sheep peacefully grazing, or a wheat field waving in the wind, yet both are examples of deforestation. Where there once was a biodiverse natural forest, we now have a ranch or a farm. In other words, we judge the book by the cover and equate beauty with ecological health and unsightliness with destruction of nature. These impressions have led many environmentalists to support cutting fewer trees, as if our forests are disappearing. But they're not. There is the same area of forest in the US and Canada today as there was 100 years ago. If anything, it's growing. This despite the fact that the population has tripled. But the professional environmentalists are never satisfied. They behave as if every tree should be protected and that the products they yield are unnecessary. This is badly misguided. The correct position, from a purely environmental perspective, is to grow more trees, the world's most abundant renewable resource, and use more wood. We can do both. In the end, we're all tree huggers. I'm Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace for Prager University.
And that's what's going to set us up for the rest of today's show. I'm going to point out a National Geographic story from 2009. And it was actually echoed in, I think, May 17th edition of the USA Today. Trees migrating north due to warming. Finding of a study led by the U.S. Forest Service concludes that a few dozen tree species in the eastern U.S. are moving north at an unexpected rate, likely due to global warming. Of course, global warming, it's the answer for everything. In a paper appearing this month, this is February of 2009, in the journal Forest Ecology and Management, the study authors documented the northward march of 40 major tree species over 30 eastern states based on the distribution of seedlings versus mature trees. Previous studies of plant migrations had been done using only computer simulations, or they focused on how some species are climbing up hills and mountains, said co-author Chris Oswalt of the Forest Service Southern Research Station in Knoxville, Tennessee. By contrast, the new study looked at movement based on latitude using a sampling of the Forest Service most recent ground-based data. The finding confirms the link between global warming and forest migration, said lead study author Chris Woodall of the Forest Service Northern Research Station in St. Paul, Minnesota. This is no longer conjecture, he said. It's conjecture. Conjecture not so much in the fact that the trees are moving. It's conjecture that global warming is actually the cause of that. Let me explain. In order to explain, we're going to show a clip from Mark Seeley, who's the Minnesota State climatologist, who was at the climate change town hall meeting put on by Congresswoman Betty McCollum back in January or February.
Share with you. This is from our state climate office and is simply a depiction of all of the pooled data So all observations in the state aggregated into what we call a statewide mean value for annual temperature and annual precipitation. So on the vertical axis here above the flat horizontal line would be wet years depicted, years that were wetter than average. And if we look at the central vertical line and we look to the right of it, those would be years that were warmer than what the historical average was. And each dot would represent an individual year in our record back to 1895. So you see a scatter there. Those of you used to working with statistics see a pretty wide scatter in those data. If we overlay those data with all the records since 1987, we suddenly see a pattern emerge towards wetness and warmth. All of the years since 1987 are depicted there in red, and you will note that the vast majority of them are on the warm side of the distribution and the wet side of the distribution. That is the pronounced direction those two attributes of our Minnesota climate is moving. It's moving in those directions very, very rapidly. We also need to acknowledge that that's not the case every place else. We all have relatives and friends that live in other sections of our country. However, we should acknowledge that we happen to live in a part of the American landscape that is experienced.
All right, now let's take a look at what he's got here. Rate of temperature change in the U.S. from 1901 to 2008. Notice the New England and the Great Lakes and some of the West and the Southwest all experiencing temperature change. But yet, notice that we have areas in the Southeast that are not really experiencing change to the warmth. Actually, some of it's cool. Now, ask yourself this. Have you noticed more and more trees since 1987? Have you? We have been planting more and more and more and more trees because that is around the time that climate change as we know it, global warming hype, really started. Now, there's some of it back in the 70s. I'm not going to discount that. But really, when we started getting this takeover of an indoctrination on global warming is a thing we actually have to combat, we started planting more trees. And as a result, we are changing our ecosystem. And so as we notice, and I just mentioned about how the trees are moving north, is it because of the temperature or is it causing the temperature? What about the wetness? I mean, if this is a video, so if we were to be able to move it back and show his little graph, and you see 2016 hotter and wetter, and I think Dallas is going to try here. Let's see if we can go back a little bit. I just need anywhere in that graph right there. That's good. So you notice all the stuff from 1987. How many more trees have we planted since 1987? And then notice that he's got 2016 marked, but he does not have the dates for all the other ones. I would like to know where the 2013-2014 winter was, because that was when we were in polar vortex. So if an average temperature and precipitation shows warmth in 2016, I would like to know if polar vortex is on there or where on there it is to show that we've actually had cooler or drier. Because this is not giving us really anything other than what the climatologist wants us to believe. But again, there's no context other than showing a whole bunch of dots after we planted more trees and then we prohibited cutting down mature trees. That's the only thing that tells me. And the fact that we are coming out of a little ice age, and we discussed that last week when we had shown a graph about the core ice temperature, or the core ice in Greenland. So anyhow, come on back to me, Dallas. That was the Minnesota State climatologist discussing the fact that we have wetter and warmer years. Average temperatures are wetter and warmer. And the last couple of weeks we brought in space weather, and I really don't think we have too much of space. We don't think we have any space weather on the docket for today, but I'll tell you the one thing that is missing from this equation, the solar cycle. We have solar maximum and solar minimum. Solar maximum is usually when we have things like the polar vortex. solar minimum is usually when we have a heat wave. And right now, starting in 2016 into 2017 and going through 2019, we are actually getting into the warmer part of a solar cycle, which means that we are having less and less sunspots. We are having more of coronal holes, which give us more solar wind. And that's one of the things that keeps us warmer. So if you take a look at all of this, this does not account at all as to the rise and fall of the maximum and minimum in the solar cycle. So there's some stuff there that he's not telling us. Now, I will give him the benefit of the doubt that even as a climatologist, he may not even know about space weather, and I think that that's part of the thing that's missing from this entire equation. Now, getting back to trees. Now, here's the question. What came first, rain or the rainforest? That's a good question. Let's see what we can find out from the answer.
A tropical rainforest without rain wouldn't be much of a rainforest. I mean, all plants need water to grow, and without it, they shrivel up and die. So what about the ancient Hawaiian proverb, Hahai no ka ua I ka ulula au, which means the rain follows after the forest? How could that be? Well, all land plants lose water when the pores on their leaves open up during photosynthesis, and this evaporation draws more water up through their stems. With so much rain soaking the soil in rainforests, water is nearly unlimited, and accordingly, rainforest trees can afford to move and lose more water than other plants. All that water vapor rising from the forest feeds moisture-laden clouds while also causing convection. Together, these effects accelerate the formation of rain, which falls to the soil and gets taken up all over again. This cycle of absorption, evaporation, and rain happens everywhere there are plants. However, super wet soil, fast-pumping trees, and hot tropical sun make the cycle so fast in the rainforest that, unlike other biomes where clouds might form in one place and rain in another, in a rainforest, all that water stays in the same region. Without the forest pumping so much water into the air, rainforests wouldn't be as rainy. And without so much rain, the forest couldn't pump so much water into the air. So which came first, the rain or the rainforest? Well, before rainforests, ancestors of trees like cypress, pine, and spruce dominated the land. But they were conservative when it came to using and losing water, so the air tended to be dry, meaning less rain. However, around 130 million years ago, a new kind of plant developed that took the risk of losing more water in return for souped-up photosynthesis. These were the flowering plants, and their risk paid off. Their faster growth enabled them to outcompete the ancestral pines and take over the tropical regions of the globe. These angiosperms lost so much water into the air that as they spread, they brought their own rain with them. And today, tropical rainforests receive more rain than if they were pine forests. In some places, as much as 1 meter more rain each year. That's equivalent to an extra 2.5 hours of heavy rain each week. Not surprisingly, all that water cools off the forest too, which is why the Amazon isn't nearly as hot as the Sahara or even an East Texas pine forest in summer. But the hot, dry tropics of the past may soon be a part of our future. In parts of the Amazon where vast swaths of rainforest have been logged or cleared for agriculture, unusual droughts are already occurring, and forest fires have become more frequent. Scientists worry that these changes will lead to ever hotter, drier, and more flammable tropics in the coming decades, making things tougher both for the remaining forest and for the people who live there. So when in drought, plant a tree. Seriously, Hahai no ka ua I ka ulula au. This episode of Minute Earth is...
The rain follows after the forest. Remember that. There was a time, about 100, 150 years ago, a friend of mine was doing some research into some of the early settlers in Minnesota. And he had discovered some of the early survey cards, and they were actually listing where they were finding trees, and rarely would he find hardwoods, except for certain pockets, north of the 45th parallel, which is around Roselawn Avenue. And if you actually go into Maplewood to the Slumberland store and go on one of the their steps, you can actually find a plaque that mentions that this is the 45th parallel. There were not that many hardwood trees north of the 45th parallel. What was the climate in Minnesota 100 to 150 years ago? With the exception of some hardwoods that you would find extremely far up north around what we would now call the Boundary Waters Canoe area, or along, say, the St. Croix River or the St. Louis River or the Rum River, the areas where we had logging back in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, you would find a lot of marshland, a lot of prairie grass, blue stem prairie, that pervaded the entire area. And yet, over the last 150 years, we have proceeded in getting rid of a lot of the blue stem prairie and bringing in wheat. Hey, we're breadbasket of the world right here. During our Middle Eastern series, we actually highlighted the fact that Minnesota grain farmers were punished by President Jimmy Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union as a response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But 150 years ago, we were not planting wheat. But wheat has changed the environment in Minnesota. And I guess we can call wheat an invasive species, maybe? I'm kidding. But the fact is, now we have hardwoods all over the place, and we are not, trimming them down. We're not chopping down a lot of mature trees. We don't have that big of a logging industry, at least in the central and southern parts of the state. We do still have a vibrant logging industry in the northern part of the state, and even then, that suffers from some economic decline. Again, as we have an economic cycle that goes up and down. But I look back at the city of Maplewood, where I live. I saw photos from 1964 and 1976, back when it was all farmland. Maplewood was farmland. I look at a 1976 photo of the then newly constructed Maplewood Mall, and the only thing you saw was the mall and White Bear Avenue going north to south, but there's nothing else around there except farm fields. It was like a mall isolated from everywhere. But what do you see there today? You see residential and commercial development, but you also see a lot more hardwood trees. A friend of mine who has only lived in his house his entire life, he was born a couple of years after his parents bought it and built the house in like 1955. He was reminding me of how when he was a kid, he used to have his garden in the backyard and it was always filled with sunlight, and they had a couple of trees planted there. Now, 50 to 60 years later, these trees are humongous, and there's no light coming into his garden anymore because he has all these very thick, huge, mature trees. And if you drive anywhere through Maplewood, you're going to see a whole bunch of 50-plus-year-old mature trees all over the place. Well, rain follows the forest, and if you were to take a look at the trees in Maplewood, kind of like a mini forest, is it any surprise we get so much rain? But then I take a look at Woodbury. When I first moved to Minnesota in 1989, actually even before then, when I was visiting, Woodbury was the same way. I remember when the Woodbury City Hall was built on Radio Drive, and that was the only thing around there. Now it's major commercial area. You take a look at Lake Elmo, and that was all farm fields. Now we're starting to see more residential development. Same thing. I remember Oakdale when you've got more residential development. And now we're starting to see Denmark Township as one of the last bastions of fertile farm fields. The ecology of this state has changed through development and through tree planting and not chopping down mature trees. So is it any wonder we have had wetter springs and even wetter falls, as we have more and more trees that require that much more water, and so the water cycles have actually been attracted to this area by the trees. And then upper Michigan and southern Canada, Ontario, northern New York, and into Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire, it's the same thing. We have built up a tree belt, and we've been getting warmer temperatures, and we've been getting more rain as a result. We're going to show you a quick clip right now just of the transpiration of a forest. Watch the evaporation.
Well, wildfires this year have.
And that is what it looks like to see trees in mass transpiring. That's what happens in our climate. That's what happens when, I mean, we don't always see it quite like that, but that is what happens. I mean, the water vapor comes out of the trees and into the air, and it gets recycled back through water and back through more rain and back through more thunderstorms. And as a matter of fact, that's actually one of the things where the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, talks about a glacier that's kind of being ruined. It's becoming more arid. Well, it's because there's no more trees on the glacier. And that kind of makes an impact. So the more trees we plant, the hotter and wetter it gets. And that's kind of what's happening. So instead of saying that, oh, the earth is getting warmer and we have to fight this, what are we doing? We're fighting it in a way that's giving us hotter and wetter temperatures and moisture. That's what we're doing. That our ability to combat climate change is changing the climate in our region. That's really what the moral of the story is. But that's only half the equation. Let's take a look at how a fire cycle works. And a forest cycle, because fire and forest, and going back to last week's show, the carbon cycle, they all have a hand together. So you have a carbon cycle with carbon dioxide being assumed into trees, and they give off oxygen. And we, of course, breathe oxygen, and then we exhale carbon dioxide. But then we also have trees. Our water is attracted by trees, and therefore we get more water, and that gives off more and more water, and that impacts the water cycle. And water is needed for life, just like oxygen is needed for life, just like carbon dioxide is needed for life. Everything here is life-sustaining. But fire is also needed for life. So we're going to take a look right now at something that happened in, I believe, 1871. It's the Great Peshtigo Fire. Now, Peshtigo in Wisconsin gets overshadowed by another famous fire, and that was the Great Chicago Fire. That actually happened the same day. But Peshtigo occurred in just a little bit north of Green Bay, and it was a section of development. We were logging it out. I say we, you know, that was the western frontier was pretty much there at that time. As far as massive development, and that was a contributing factor into what happened. Let's take a look at the Peshtigo Fire of 1871.
Well, wildfires this year have destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres, hundreds of homes, and killed more than 20 people. They actually still don't compare to the deadliest wildfire in history. In 1871, Wisconsin's Peshtigo Fire killed more than 1,200 people. News 13's Bob Martin has the story from Wisconsin.
In 1871, the woods surrounding the bay north of Green Bay were full of sawmills. Loggers were harvesting tall white pines. Thousands of immigrants from around the world poured in. As soon as they got off the ships,
they were working. You could get a job almost immediately.
Other trees and brush that interfered with logging or clearing farmland were slashed and burned on the spot. Using fire as a tool caused problems. Intentional burns often got out of hand, and crude bucket brigades could only douse small fires. Then, on the night of October 8th, after months of drought, a deep low-pressure system spawned hurricane-velocity winds throughout the region. Small blazes exploded and merged into one enormous firestorm. It surrounded Peshtigo.
They said it sounded like 20 locomotives. The noise was immense. It was like a numbing, unbelievable. I think that was it. They couldn't believe that ordinary, what they were used to, a forest fire, was that big, and there was nowhere to go.
Within a matter of 15 to 20 minutes, the whole city was burning at one time. I can't imagine what was going through those people's minds. They knew they had to run for their life.
Survivors would tell of fireballs blasting through town, smashing into people and buildings, instantly igniting them. In Peshtigo, scores of those who were trapped by the rapidly advancing flames took refuge here in the waters of the Peshtigo River.
They had to fight domestic animals, wild animals, boats, just terrible people fighting for a spot, really. People that couldn't swim actually wouldn't get in the river, and they burned at the river's edge.
When the sun came up, the bodies of 800 people, almost half the population of Peshtigo, lay in the charred rubble. In one night, what residents described as swirling fire tornadoes had burned more than a dozen towns. In Williamsonville, flames chased the 77 residents into open fields. 60 are dead. Some reportedly took their own lives as the fire closed in. Tornado Park now memorializes the fire tornado's victims. Experts say the full death toll across the region was probably about 2,500. Today, a small museum in Peshtigo houses artifacts like a melted watch, a scorched Bible. Next door, a mass grave for 350 victims who were never identified. All of the original white pines in the area were ultimately clear-cut. There is only one small stand of towering old-growth white pines left. The wife of a lumber baron had 20 acres spared to serve as a place of reflection. Bob Martin, KRQE News 13, near Peshtigo, Wisconsin.
That was, of course, a tragedy. It was completely avoidable, but that's when we didn't really have fire science quite like we do today. Wisconsin, of course, is not the only area that was impacted by massive wildfires back in the 19th century. Minnesota was too, 19th and 20th centuries. We're also going to take a look at another big burn out west, because we had the Great Hinckley Fire just 23 years later. 1894, central northern Minnesota burned, and that was another catastrophe, and that also could have been avoided.
I'm meteorologist Mark Mancuso, and on this day in weather history, September 1st, 1894, a major fire incinerated the town of Hinckley, Minnesota. It was the deadliest fire in Minnesota history. After a 2-month drought combined with high temperatures, several small fires started in the forests of Pine County. At the time, loggers would strip trees of their branches, scattering them on the ground. They would burn the debris before moving on. However, some loggers did not. That leftover flammable debris littered the ground. Also contributing to the Great Fire was a temperature inversion that trapped the gases from the fires. The air came rushing down into the fires to create a vortex or tornado of flames, which then began to move quickly and grew larger and larger into a fierce firestorm. Temperatures rose to at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Barrels of nails melted into one mass, and in the yards of the Eastern Minnesota Railroad, the wheels of the cars fused with the rails. Some residents were able to escape by climbing into wells or by reaching ponds or the Grindstone River. Others crowded trains that narrowly escaped town. James Root, an engineer on a train heading south from Duluth, rescued about 300 people by backing up a train 5 miles to Skunk Lake, where passengers were able to escape the blaze. When it was over, the inferno destroyed 6 towns and 200,000 acres lay black and smoldering. It was so devastating that it lasted only 4 hours, but destroyed everything in its path. 418 perished, but some believe close to 800 was the actual figure. I'm Mark Mancuso.
Are you noticing a pattern here? Logging slash or cluttered forest coupled with a drought and a temperature inversion equals catastrophe. You know, I spent some time as a wildland firefighter, so I guess this is in my wheelhouse. This is kind of why I'm excited about doing this episode. The thing is, there is a fire triangle. You need heat, fuel, and oxygen. That's what you need to have a fire. And those 3 elements have to be there all the time. If you do not have heat, you do not have fire. If you do not have oxygen, you do not have fire. If you do not have fuel, you do not have fire. And so in fire mitigation, you have to eliminate at least one of those 3 components in order to get rid of fire. If you get rid of the fuels, you don't have a fire. A lot of times, the firefighters, especially structural, they try to get rid of oxygen and heat. Those are the 2 things. That's why when they spray their hoses, they go to the base of the fire, because they're able to snuff out the oxygen that's on the fuel and at the same time cool it down and get rid of the heat. The fire triangle is the same, whichever way you look at it. But what do we have in in Peshtigo, we had fuel with thick forests and logging slash. We had oxygen just right there in the atmosphere. And then, of course, we had a drought which dried everything up and then added heat with the temperature inversion. It's the same combination that occurred in Hinckley in 1894. And that was probably the same thing that happened in 1910 with the Big Burn. Yes, there was a big burn that occurred out of Idaho in 1910. And let's take a look at a little bit of a history of the Big Burn.
Fanned by 70-mile-an-hour hurricane-force winds, the fires merged and raced across 3 million acres of virgin timberland. The inferno blew down entire hillsides of trees like they were matchsticks. It said the timber burned in those few days could have supplied the entire United States for 15 years. The Devil's Broom swept through the town of Wallace, leaving death and destruction in its wake. More than 80 people perished, many of them firefighters, overcome by the tremendous heat and the smoke. One survivor stated, "The fire turned trees and men into weird torches that exploded like Roman candles." Northern Idaho's Clearwater Forest was one of the region's hardest hit by the 1910 fire. And on August 20th, 2007, it seemed that history was about to repeat itself.
When I started hearing that Missoula was breaking temperature records that were set in 1910, 1934, 1967, fuel moisture is at an all-time low, the energy released from these fires is at an all-time high. And so that creates conditions where fire behavior is not what people are used to. Last weekend, we actually did have a break in the weather, and it cooled off, and we got some moisture. They didn't have that in 1910. The other big difference was, in 1910, my understanding was there was a cold front passage that brought 3 days of sustained winds.
Those sustained winds helped usher in a new mission for the Forest Service, to declare war on wildfire and help shape America's fire strategy for most of the 20th century.
Probably the single.
And at the end of the 20th century, 1996, I was actually on the front lines in that war against forest fire. I trained with the Minnesota Interagency Fire Control Center up in Grand Rapids, and then I was sent to Oregon and spent a lot of time working on the Tower Fire, a 60,000-acre blaze. And this is really when my eyes are opened to understanding how forests need to be managed, how forests aren't being managed, what good managed forests look like and which poor managed forests look like, and how wildfire and fire impacts forest and forest regeneration, and how everything is all in a cycle. And if we understand that cycle, we can do the best practices to make sure everything continues to operate along that cycle. But when we start changing policies that disrupt that cycle, that's when catastrophes usually occur. First is to understand what's going on, and then you make your changes. Unlike what we're seeing with the IPCC, they don't even fully understand everything, and they're out there trying to make changes, and then we get something like the Paris Climate Accord, which, again, without having a complete data set of really understanding how everything works together, they're out trying to change policy. And that's kind of what the whole message here is. Because we're going to take a look closer, a little bit more at the fire cycle. You know, we've looked last week at the carbon cycle. And we even looked a little bit at the solar cycle, more so about the impact of solar flares, coronal mass ejections, and the impact on the Earth's magnetosphere and how that is at the poles. That's a cyclical thing. We looked already in the beginning of the show at rain or rainforest, that the rain follows the forest. It's part of the forest cycle and the water cycle. Now we're going to take a look right now at the fire cycle. But before we get into that, more specifically, we're going to take a look at one more Minnesota example, something that happened in 1918, and that was Moose Lake and Cloquet had a major fire up there. And here is an interview with one of the survivors of that fire.
Probably the single biggest historical regional event in Carl Halverson's life happened on October 12, 1918. The massive and deadly Moose Lake Cloquet fires burned an estimated 1,500 square miles. 38 towns and villages were destroyed and 453 lives were claimed, with hundreds of thousands of farm animals perishing as well. The $100 million fire was an event that Carl remembered vividly as an 11-year-old boy. Carl said he and his family heard the news from passers-by on Highway 27 who painted a grim picture of the deadly inferno.
And they started telling us, and I always remember I stood there listening and thought how terrible that was. They said Ottumwa, Kettle River, Moose Lake, Waller, Kettle River, all of them towns had burnt, you know. The whole country was as black as coal. God, black coal. Yeah, and they came and told us that, and talking about all the people that burned. I was standing there 11 years old, listening to all that. But how terrible that must be.
Carl said one of the highest death rates occurred about 1 mile south of the town of Kettle River on Highway 73 at a point called Dead Man's Curve.
That's a mile south of Kettle River. And they were going, I suppose, as fast as the cars could go in that thick smoke, one car following the taillights of the other. And they went straight off the corner into a popple wood and piled up there. Many cars, one on top of the other. Death loss was really heavy there. People ran from their cars into the wood, suffocated and burnt in all directions there. Yeah, there was George Mushock. He had a planing mill and a sawmill right where the Kettle River School stands now. And he drove his car into that same mess, and he had started running, and a couple of 100 feet down is the Kettle River running, see, below the curve. And he was found right near the river burn.
Fortunately, Carl and the family homestead in Split Rock Township had been spared. His older sister, Cora Madsen, and her husband, George, concerned about the Halverson homestead, decided to make a 14-mile trek from Moose Lake to Split Rock to see how the family had fared.
So they started out in the morning, imagine drive up that 4 miles from Moose Lake to Highcliffe Hill. Nothing but dead people and animals, wagon loads, horses dead, wagon loads of people burnt black in the ditch off the road, you know. Well, they got as far as the 4 mile corner. Cora was almost nuts already. He was just hysterical. Told George to turn back. Turn back. She couldn't stand it no more. So they drove back to Moose Lake.
Interestingly, Carl said some people profited from the fire by turning in fraudulent claims.
All of these that lost everything put in fire claims. Well, there were some that had nothing but a few log shacks, but there was no telling from ashes what they had.
What was what?
You know, so they turned in some awful big claims. Many of these farms right here in Split Rock built big houses and big barns because their claims were so big.
And Carl said that Duluth was spared because many of the citizens there had heard what was coming.
7 o'clock in the evening, 7 o'clock in the evening, the wind was blowing right to the heights of Duluth. And they had all those damn people that volunteered to fight it. You went up there, up on the high parts, you know, and they fought the fire. You know, you go out of Duluth, then you get out of that big high, and it's, you know, more level country. But they stopped it there, so it didn't burn any buildings in Duluth at all.
Carl said it was a lone, barren, plowed field that separated and saved the Halverson homestead from the inferno. A fire mostly blamed on a hot and dry October, sparks from railroad engines, and faulty logging practices that had produced beds of dry wood scraps that acted as perfect kindling for a wildfire.
In 2006, I had the distinguished honor of being able to bring a longtime friend of mine, Ernie Matson, back to Crosby. And that's where he was living. He was 3 years old. He was born in 1915. And the Cloquet fire had destroyed his childhood home. His father had died, and Ernie and his 2 siblings had escaped. And then because his mother was unable to raise 3 children on her own, then he ended up going to a state-run orphanage in Owatonna. But Ernie had never been back in 88 years until, I think it was 88. I think he was 91 at the time. I brought him back, and he remembered everything with instant recall. He says, I haven't been here in my life, not since that incident happened. But what I'm seeing right now is my mother grabbing me by the hand and holding my younger sister, and we were running through a meadow, and he described everything. And keep in mind, he was only 3 years old. So that memory stuck with him the rest of his life. He passed away in 2013 at the age of 97. One other remarkable thing about my friend Ernie Matson is that he was also a Pearl Harbor survivor, having been on the USS Nevada on December 7th, 1941. So Ernie was a remarkable man, and so I wanted to make sure that I brought him up in this narrative today. So we've seen wildfire that has gone through, but notice a pattern. The same pattern actually existed in Europe. At the time of 15 and 1600s, when we were getting civilization there. Wildfire would occur when civilizations were being built. And then when it became modernized, that's when there was not that much construction, and we weren't tearing apart forests, and then it would be going somewhere else. And in our colonial era, in the 16 and 1700s, in the east coast of the United States of America, or what we call the U.S. today, it was the same thing. We would take away land out of the forest and build, and that was when we would get wildfires, big ones. And by 1871, progress caught up with Peshtigo, Wisconsin. And then in 1894, progress caught up in Hinckley, Minnesota. Progress caught up in Idaho in 1910. But we still didn't learn those lessons by 1918 in Cloquet and Moose Lake. But what now have we heard in the last 30 years about the rainforests in South America? It's a catastrophe because people are cutting down the forest to build villages. It's no different than what we did here. It's no different what the Europeans did. It's no different than what the Australians did. That's part of progress, and that's how civilization advances. And perhaps when they actually start doing that a little bit more in certain areas of Africa, we might actually see some more economic progress going on there. But wildfire comes in cycles. But we don't have quite as many wildfires today as we used to. That's because we've learned a little bit in theory how to manage a forest. But now we're going to take a look at wildland firefighting, because the question now is, does that what we do actually make things worse? The answer might surprise you.
Survivors of the 1871 fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which vaporized 1.5 million acres of forest and killed 1,500 people, reported a wall of flame 5 miles wide that traveled at 90 miles per hour and tossed trains into the air. 4 decades later, an even larger inferno roared through the Rocky Mountains, scorching an area the size of Connecticut. These epic wildfires and similar ones in between helped spawn the U.S. Forest Service and forged its aggressive policy to not only prevent wildfires, but to smother any that did start by no later than 10 a.m. the next day. And for a time, this policy seemed to work. The annual number of fires and area burned plummeted between 1920 and 1970. But fewer fires led to denser, more flammable forests, packed with the combustible needles of young conifers and the tinder-dry branches of dead or dying trees. So despite a continuing decline in the number of wildfires since 1970, the average blaze today burns hotter, faster, and bigger than it used to. And the total area burned per year in the U.S. has more than doubled. Costs have flared too. The Forest Service now spends 52% of its annual budget on fire prevention and suppression, up from 16% just 20 years ago. What's more, wildfires will keep getting harder to tame as climate change turns forests hotter and drier, and homes edge further into fire-prone regions. The good news is that we can prevent future wildfires from getting so wild by taming forest fuel supply now. Essentially, this means letting some fires burn, or even starting them ourselves when conditions aren't too dry or windy, or selectively logging to thin out dangerously crowded growth. When and where we've used it, this strategy has made fires cooler, slower, and less destructive. For instance, when a blaze ripped through Okanagan County in Washington state in 2006, untamed swaths of forest lost 92% of their trees, while just 49% perished in areas recently thinned by cutting and controlled burns. And in 2002, parcels of recently burned land put the brakes on wildfires racing across Arizona's pine forests. These and other successes have led forest managers to prescribe controlled burning for much of the fire-prone western U.S., but few forests actually receive their recommended dosage. That's largely because while the U.S. Forest Service can in theory write prescriptions for every tract of land it manages, it relies on Congress for the money to fill them. And so far, Congress allocates the vast majority of fire management funds to emergency measures rather than preventive ones. Plus, while emergency costs continue to surge, the Forest Service's budget doesn't. So fire managers are often forced to steal money from already meager fuel reduction programs to fight this year's blazes, thus fueling the risk that next year's fires will be costlier, deadlier, and more disastrous. So as counterintuitive as controlled burns may seem, it's time for Congress to understand that by not playing with fire, they are playing with fire. This episode of Minute Earth.
It's not just time for Congress to understand it. This is also time for the environmentalists to understand it. This is time for Al Gore to understand it. Betty McCollum needs to understand this. IPCC needs to understand this. And notice, with all these videos of the fires, look how much smoke went into the atmosphere. That's all carbon dioxide. There's more carbon going back into the air, but what's happened over the last 100 years? It's all come back down into the ground and back into trees. It's part of the cycle. Now, let's take a look at how fires are actually good for forests.
With California facing a mega drought, many fear that fire season this year will be bigger and more devastating than previous years. But is there a way we could fight forest fires with fire? Hey guys, Julia here for DNews. With drought drying up the West, the threat of wildfires is more dire than ever. In the past 5 years, many states have seen the biggest fires in 50 years. Previous wildfires have caused millions of dollars in damage to homes and properties. Some fires were even deadly. So it's no wonder the U.S. government spends billions every year to fight them. But unfortunately, it's not a simple case as some bear in a hat wants us to believe. Historically, places like California saw big burns every year. But as more and more people moved west, forest fires had to be stopped. But decades of fighting forest fires actually made things worse for a little while. It made some ecosystems less diverse. And suppressing natural fires led to a buildup of debris and clutter on the forest floor, setting the stage for disasters to come. After the Yellowstone fires of 1988 and the fire season of 2000, people began to understand that some ecosystems need fire. They've evolved to make use of it. Fire is part of their natural life cycle. Fire benefits an ecosystem in a few ways. Sometimes it breaks down nutrients in a flash, literally. It breaks down nutrients from leaves, logs, and other debris that otherwise would have taken years or decades to break down and return to the soil. Some plants actually need fire and heat to thrive, like the giant sequoias in Sierra Nevada region in California. They need the heat of fire to reproduce. Sequoias make large cones that only open and disperse their seeds when they dry up. One of the primary ways they dry out is, you guessed it, the heat of a fire. But they aren't the only ones. In the pinelands of New Jersey, there's several species that need fire to reproduce, including the pygmy pitch pine. This small plant evolved a few ways to fight fire. It's got thick bark that protects it from heat, but if the trunk happens to be damaged by fire, it can regrow sprouts from the wound. Fire doesn't just help things grow. Sometimes its powers of destruction are for good. By clearing out clutter, it can destroy invasive species or harmful insects, and can even open up the dense forest canopy to allow sunlight to reach the forest floor so more things can grow. It also creates new areas of grasslands, which some species of animals depend on for shelter or food. So what do we do? Is there a way we can protect our homes while still allowing these delicate ecosystems to thrive? So every year, some forestry services practice what's called controlled burn or prescribed fire. Yes, there are people whose job it is to set fires on purpose, but it's a tricky business. The conditions have to be just right or a fire could get quickly out of control. If conditions are too dry, the fire can get too hot or too big, and there are a few cases of controlled burns getting out of control. If too damp, well, nothing's going to burn. In the pinelands of New Jersey, parameters for burning are tight, like it has to be under 55 degrees, wind speed should be around 7 to 12 miles per hour, and about 2 or 3 days since the last rainfall. In some years, they can burn up to 22,000 acres of forest a year in controlled burns, and this policy seems to be helping. One study published in the journal Ecosphere found that areas that were purposefully burned had twice as many native plant species as non-burned areas after 10 years. And other studies from the Ecological Society of America showed that prescribed burns reduce the severity of wildfires. But these are small, very well-managed, controlled burns. So it seems it really pays to fight fire with fire, but only if you're a professional with a permit, so still listen to that bear in a hat. Have you got any more burning science?
So here's the way here's the way it should work. That's what I wanted to say. I'm not going to have time to get really into that discussion. I will tell you this from my experience in 1996 wildland firefighting. I was one who actually was fortunate enough to have a fusee, and I did light a controlled burn. That was kind of cool. The ones who had the drip torches and some of the more sophisticated equipment were the more experienced members on our crew, and they absolutely loved it. Wildland firefighting is a very, very hot, dirty, grimy job. We worked like 105 hours a week, but it was extremely rewarding. But the thing that didn't make sense to us then, and still doesn't make sense today, is a lot of the Forest Service policies. They did not make sense that we had to not scar the earth. You have a wildland fire, it's going to scar the earth. They would not let us come in and take bulldozers and build the proper defenses against it. On the other hand, maybe just letting it burn is probably a better answer. So we do have some policy things that are definitely wrong, and perhaps we'll have another time to discuss that. So we're going to leave you today with Johnny Cash, Lumberjack.
I lived on a farm out in Iowa. I pulled the corn and I worked in the hay. Got trapped by a girl, but I wiggled free. Heard the Oregon timber calling me. Will you tell me something, Mr. Lumberjack? Is it 1 for forward and 3 for back? Is it 2 for stop or 4 for go? Boy, ask a whistle punk, I don't know. Well, I learned this fact from a logger named Ray. You don't
For Dallas Pearson, producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis, reminding you there's 185 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. See you next week.
Will you tell me something, Mr. Lumberjack? Is it 1 for forward and 3 for back? Is it 2 for stop or 4 for go? Boy, ask a whistle punk, I don't know. Well, you work in the woods from morning to night. You laugh and sing and you cuss and fight. On Saturday night you go to Eugene. And on a Sunday morning your pockets are clean. Will you tell me something, Mr. Lumberjack? Is it 1 for forward and 3 for back? Is it 2 for stop or 4 for go? Boy, ask a whistle punk, I don't